The day they made me wash dishes at my own grandson's birthday party, I stood at that kitchen sink with my hands in cold, soapy water, listening to the sound of laughter drifting in from the living room, and I made myself a promise. I promised myself that I would not cry. Not there, not in front of them. Not with the smell of birthday cake in the air and the sound of my grandchildren's voices singing Happy Birthday, while I scraped frosting off paper plates and stacked them next to the trash can. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a woman who cries easily. I spent 34 years married to a man who used to say that I was the strongest person he had ever met in his life. He would look at me across the dinner table sometimes. Just look at me, and shake his head slowly, like he couldn't quite believe I was real. "Grace," he would say, "you could survive anything." And I would laugh and tell him to stop being dramatic, but standing there at that kitchen sink, with my son's wife's casserole dish in my hands, and the sound of balloons popping in the next room, I understood for the first time that survival and dignity are two very different things. My husband died 31 days before that birthday party. 31 days. I had been counting. When you lose someone you have loved for more than 3 decades, you count the days the way a drowning person counts the seconds between waves. You count because it is the only way to mock that time is still passing, that the world is still turning, that you are still somehow breathing and moving and existing, even though the person who made your existence feel meaningful is gone. His name was Richard Allen Harmon, and if you have ever loved someone so completely that their absence feels like a physical wound, like something has been removed from your body without anesthesia, then you already understand everything I'm about to tell you without me having to say another word. But I am going to say it anyway, because he asked me to stay silent for too long, and now, finally, I don't have to. Before I tell you what happened at that birthday party, before I tell you about the knock at the door and the bag my sister-in-law was carrying and the envelope that changed everything, I need you to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, because what I'm about to share with you is the kind of story that people need to hear, the kind that reminds you that grace, real grace, the kind that lives in your spine, and not just your name, always finds its way back to you in the end. Leave me a comment below and tell me, have you ever been made to feel invisible by the people who were supposed to love you? Because I know I am not alone in this. I know it. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in a small house on Clover Street, in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. My father worked at a tool and dye shop, and my mother cleaned houses 3 days a week to help cover the mortgage. We were not poor, but we were the kind of family that understood the weight of money, understood that it did not come easily, and did not stay without effort. There were 4 of us children, and we all knew, by the time we were old enough to carry a laundry basket, that nothing in this life was given. Everything was earned. I was the second oldest. My older brother Tom was the responsible one, the one who fixed things and never complained. My younger sister Deborah was the pretty one, the one who got out of chores by smiling at our father. And then there was Michael, the baby, who our mother spoiled without apology because she said the last child always deserved a little extra tenderness. I was the in-between one, not the oldest, not the youngest, not the prettiest, not the most charming. But I was the one who stayed. When things needed doing, I did them. When someone needed taking care of, I was the one who showed up. I think about that a lot now, about how the ones who show up are so often the ones who end up invisible. Our house on Clover Street was small in the way that houses become large through memory. 2 bedrooms shared among the 4 of us children. A bathroom with a finicky hot water heater that my father was always threatening to replace, but never quite got around to. A kitchen where my mother spent what seemed like most of her waking hours, because in our family, the kitchen was where everything happened, where homework got done at the table in the evenings, where my father sat with his coffee on Saturday mornings and read the newspaper section by section, folding it back along creases that grew soft over the week, where my mother stood at the stove on Sunday afternoons, making the kind of slow, patient food that fills a house with warmth for hours before it ever reaches the table. I learned to cook in that kitchen, not because anyone sat me down and taught me, but because I watched and because I stayed. I was the one who asked if I could help. I was the one who wanted to know why the onions had to be softened before the other vegetables, what the difference was between simmering and boiling, how you could tell when a pie crust was actually done and not just golden-colored. My mother would answer my questions patiently, wiping her hands on her apron, showing me things with the calm efficiency of a woman who had long since made peace with the demands of feeding a family of 6 on a careful budget. My father was a good man in the specific way that men of that generation and background were good. He worked hard. He came home. He didn't drink too much. He never raised his hand to anyone. He was not a demonstrative man. He showed love through presence and provision rather than words or gestures. And you had to learn to read him the way you learn to read weather, by pattern and sign rather than direct statement. When he was proud of something one of us had done, he would look at my mother across the dinner table and nod, once, and she would nod back, and that was the exchange. I understood, as I grew older, that this was its own kind of tenderness, but it took growing older to understand it. My mother was warmer, more verbal. She told us she loved us in the morning before school and at night before bed, and she meant it every time in a way you could feel. She was also, and I recognized this in myself much later, with a complicated mixture of recognition and sorrow, the one who held everything together by simply never stopping. She was always doing something, always moving. The house was always in order. The meals were always made. The permission slips were always signed. The appointments were always kept. And nobody ever asked her how she managed it, because the managing appeared as effortless as breathing. It was not effortless. Nothing that appears effortless ever is. But she had internalized the invisibility of her own labor so completely that she could not have told you, if you had asked, how much of herself went into the maintenance of everyone else's lives. She would have said, "Oh, it's nothing." She would have meant it. That was what worried me most looking back. I was good in school, not brilliantly, not the kind of good that gets you scholarships from prestigious places, but reliably good, the kind of student teachers appreciate because you pay attention and you turn things in on time, and you do not cause difficulty. I liked English and history. I was adequate at mathematics. I had a small, close circle of friends from elementary school who stayed with me through high school. The kind of friendships built on proximity and familiarity that become genuine through sheer accumulation of shared experience. I went to Ohio State after high school. I studied education because I liked children and because it seemed like a practical degree, the kind that leads somewhere definite. I graduated and took a job teaching 3rd grade at an elementary school in Westerville that fall. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment, my first real solitude, the first time I had ever lived entirely alone. And I found that I liked it more than I had expected, and that I was lonelier than I had expected. Both things were true simultaneously, which is often how important truths work. I was 22 years old, and I had a job I liked, and a future that felt open in the way futures feel, when you are young enough not to have made any of the choices that will eventually define them. I was not looking for anything in particular. I was just living. And then I went to a church picnic on a Saturday in June, and a man was arguing about baseball by the lemonade table, and everything began. I met Richard at a church picnic when I was 22 years old. He was 26, and he was standing by the lemonade table arguing passionately with the pastor about the designated hitter rule in baseball. And I remember thinking that he was either the most interesting man I had ever encountered or a complete lunatic, possibly both. He had dark brown hair that fell across his forehead when he talked fast, which was always. And he had these hands, these large, careful, deliberate hands, the hands of someone who worked with them, who built things, that he used to gesture when he was making a point, which was also always. The pastor, who was a patient man named Reverend Gould, was nodding along with the particular expression of someone who has learned that some arguments are best survived rather than won. Richard was saying something about how the designated hitter rule fundamentally changed the strategic integrity of the game, and that the National League had it right, and that anyone who disagreed was either willfully ignorant of baseball's history or simply didn't care about the game the way they claimed to. He saw me looking at him, and he stopped mid-sentence about the American League and said, "I'm sorry. I'm being rude. My name is Richard. I promise I'm not always this worked up about sports." And I said, "You're not being rude. I just came over because I wanted some lemonade." And he handed me a cup and said, "Well, now you have it, so you'll have to stay and keep me company." I stayed. I never really left. Our first real date was a week after the picnic. He took me to a diner near his apartment, and we sat in a booth for 3 hours talking, the waitress refilling our coffee 4 times, with an expression that communicated professional feelings about people who occupy tables without ordering anything additional. We tipped her well before we left. Richard always tipped well. I noticed things like that. We dated for 2 years. Long drives on Sunday mornings with the windows down, weekend trips to visit his family in Pittsburgh, where his mother cooked enormous meals, and his father argued about the same sports Richard argued about. I understood immediately that the apple had not fallen far. Hours spent on my parents' back porch, talking about everything and nothing, while the fireflies came out in the summer grass. Richard was the kind of man who listened, not the kind of listening that is really just waiting for your turn to speak. I had known men like that. But genuine, patient, curious listening. He would ask follow-up questions about things I had mentioned in passing. He would remember, months later. The name of the student I had mentioned was struggling, and ask how she was doing. I had never had that before. I had not known, until I had it, how much I had been missing it. We got married on a Saturday in June, in the same church where we met. My mother made my dress. 3 months of evenings at the sewing machine, the sound of it running late into the night. Richard's father cried during the vows. My younger sister Deborah was my maid of honor, and she gave a toast at the reception that made everyone laugh so hard the DJ had to pause the music. It was the kind of wedding that makes people smile just remembering it. Simple and real and full of actual love instead of performance. We moved into a rental house in Westerville, a little 2-bedroom with a yard that needed serious work, and a kitchen that was at least 1 appliance too small for 2 people who both liked to cook. Richard built shelves in the garage on the first weekend we were there. I planted tomatoes along the south fence the following spring, and they came in so well that we were giving bags of them away to neighbors by August. Richard was working as an electrical contractor in those early years. Long hours and unpredictable paychecks, jobs that sometimes ran long and sometimes dried up and required a particular kind of financial patience that I had been raised to have. I was teaching 3rd grade at an elementary school, 20 minutes away, and loving it in the way you can only love work that feels genuinely useful. Watching 8-year-olds discover things. Watching the moment when something that had been confusing suddenly clarifies itself in their faces. We were careful with money the way I had been taught to be careful. We had a budget that we actually kept. We saved when we could. Not much at first, but consistently. The way you build anything solid. Slowly, with whatever you have. We made most of our meals at home and packed lunches and took vacations we could drive to. Long weekends at state parks. A week at a rented cabin in Michigan one summer that remains one of my favorite memories. Richard fishing off the dock in the early morning, while I sat on the porch with a book and let the quiet work on me. We told each other that the small life we were building was enough because it was ours. We meant it completely. Our first child, Daniel, was born 3 years after we were married. He came into the world at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday in February, and Richard stood beside me through every hour of that labor with his large, careful hands wrapped around mine, and his voice steady and low, telling me I was doing fine, telling me I was the bravest person he had ever seen, telling me he loved me in the slightly broken way people say things when they are genuinely overwhelmed by feeling. When Daniel finally arrived, red-faced and furious and screaming at the audacity of existence, Richard cried for the second time I had ever seen him cry, the first having been our wedding day, and I loved him so fiercely in that moment that it frightened me a little. The fierceness of the love you feel for a new baby is its own particular terror. You understand immediately that you have handed over hostages to the universe, that something now exists, that you love more than your own continuity, and that the universe is under no obligation to be careful with it. We brought Daniel home to the rental house in Westerville on a cold Thursday morning. He slept in a bassinet beside our bed for the first weeks, and I woke for every sound he made, every small shift in his breathing, in the way of new mothers who have not yet learned to distinguish the sounds that need attention from the sounds that are simply the noise of a small person navigating the strangeness of being alive. Richard and I took turns in a loose and improvised rotation that was not so much a schedule as a mutual agreement to share the exhaustion. There were nights when we looked at each other across the bassinet at 3 in the morning, with an expression that communicated both total depletion and complete wonder simultaneously. Daniel was a serious baby, watchful, quiet, observing everything with large dark eyes that seemed to be gathering information for purposes he had not yet disclosed. He hit his milestones reliably and on schedule. He walked at 11 months. He talked early and clearly, and by the time he was 2 years old, he could hold conversations that surprised people who expected less from a toddler. He was not an easy child in the way that easy children coast. He required engagement, required answer to his endless, careful questions. But he was a deeply satisfying child to parent, because you could feel his mind working, and it was a pleasure to watch. Our daughter, Melissa, came 2 years after Daniel. She was easier and quieter, and she had Richard's dark hair and my mother's eyes. And from the time she could walk, she followed Daniel everywhere he went, like a small, determined shadow. Where Daniel was deliberate, Melissa was impulsive. Where he considered, she acted. They balanced each other in the way of siblings who were genuinely fond of each other, underneath the ordinary friction of shared space and parental attention, and watching that fondness develop. Watching them move from the primitive territorial conflict of early childhood into something that resembled actual friendship was one of the quieter joys of those years. Our house in those years was loud and messy and full full of laundry and crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, and small shoes left in the middle of the hallway, and the particular chaos of 2 children under 5 discovering the world at full volume. The rental house was too small for us by then, but we had not yet managed to save enough for a down payment on anything larger, and so we made do with the space we had, and tried to have a sense of humor about the ways 4 people in 100 square feet will inevitably occupy every available surface simultaneously. I loved every minute of it, even the hard minutes, even the exhausted, stretched thin, what was I thinking minutes. I loved it because it was mine, because I had built it, because every sticky surface and lost permission slip and middle-of-the-night fever was evidence that my life was full and real and worth something. There is a photograph from that time, I don't remember who took it, of Richard and me and the 2 children at the kitchen table in the Westerville house on some ordinary Saturday morning. Daniel is eating cereal and looking at something outside the frame with his characteristic focused intensity. Melissa is wearing one sock and has apparently been in the middle of saying something when the picture was taken because her mouth is open and her hands are in the air. Richard has his arm around my shoulders and he is laughing at something I've said, and his whole face is in it, the way his whole face was always in his laughter. And I am looking at him instead of at the camera, and I am smiling. I have that photograph on the bookshelf in my living room. I look at it sometimes and I think, that was a good morning. That was one of the 10,000 good mornings. We didn't know they were countable then. That was the gift. Richard's contracting business began to grow in the early years of our children's lives. He brought on a partner, a man named Dave Kowalski, who had been his friend since high school, a steady and capable man who complemented Richard's energy with a practical steadiness that the business needed. And together they built Harmon Kowalski Electrical into something that went from residential work to commercial contracts, from 2 trucks to a fleet of 12. The years were not without difficulty. There were economic downturns, a period in the mid-90s when commercial construction went quiet for 18 difficult months, a dispute with a general contractor that cost them a contract they had counted on. But Richard navigated those difficulties with the same patient persistence he brought to everything, and the business always came back stronger than it had been. By the time Daniel and Melissa were in middle school, we had moved from Westerville into a 4-bedroom house in Upper Arlington, with a finished basement and a backyard, with a real patio and a gas grill that Richard used every weekend from April through October, like it was a sacred responsibility. He had very specific opinions about the grill. He had marinades. He had a process for indirect heat that he explained to anyone who would listen, with an enthusiasm that suggested he genuinely believed this information was useful to them. The neighbors used to joke that you could set your calendar by the smell coming from our backyard on Sunday afternoons. We were not extravagant. That was never who we were. But we were comfortable in a way that my parents had never been comfortable, and I felt a deep and private gratitude for that comfort every single day. I understood that it had not appeared from nowhere. Richard had worked himself half to death building that business. There were years when he left the house before the children were up and came home after they were in bed. Years when the only time we had together was the 20 minutes before sleep. Years when I could feel the exhaustion on him like a second skin, and I would rub his shoulders in the dark, and he would say, "Grace, I'm going to give you everything." And I would say, "You already have," and we would both mean what we said. I had moved from teaching into running the administrative side of Harmon Kowalski when the business grew large enough to need someone full-time in the office. It was Richard's suggestion and then, quickly, my decision. I was good at it in a way that surprised me, comfortable with the systems and the paperwork and the particular organizational logic of running an operation with multiple moving parts. I handled the billing and the contracts, and the employee records, and the tax documentation, and I built the office systems from scratch in ways that actually worked, and over the years the work became genuinely mine in the way that work becomes yours when you build it rather than simply inhabit it. We were a team in the most literal sense of the word. The business ran because Richard knew electrical systems and had the relationships and the drive, and the business was healthy because I kept the books and noticed the patterns and said, more than once, "Richard, we need to look at this." There were things I caught early that would have become serious problems. There were contracts I flagged as underbid before we were committed. There were vendors I renegotiated with in ways that freed up cash at critical moments. I am not telling you this to claim credit I am not owed. I am telling you because later, much later, when things got complicated, I needed to remember that the security we had built was mine as much as his. Both of our labor, both of our judgment, both of our 34 years. The children grew. Daniel excelled academically and went to Ohio State for business and then to graduate school in finance, which in retrospect explains some things. Melissa was more social, more interested in people than in institutions, and she went to a smaller school downstate and studied communications and came out of it knowing what she wanted, which at the time appeared to be building a life that looked a certain way from the outside. I did not understand then what I mean by that now. I thought I was being critical. I was actually being perceptive and too kind to trust my own perception. We paid for both their educations without complaint and without debt to them. It was something Richard and I had agreed on when they were small, that we would give our children a start that was actually a start, not a weight that would take a decade to put down. It was a choice we made from a position of genuine love and genuine resources, and I still believe it was the right choice. What you cannot control is what people do with what you give them. Daniel married a woman named Courtney when he was 28. She was polished and sharp in a way that I had tried to appreciate. She had a good job in finance, and she dressed beautifully, and she kept her house immaculate. But there was a coldness to her that I could feel from the first time we met, a way of assessing the people around her that made you feel like a number in a column rather than a person. Richard noticed it too. He mentioned it once, carefully, on a drive home from an early dinner at their apartment, and I told him he was being uncharitable. I told myself I was being a good mother-in-law by refusing to see the worst in her. Melissa married a man named Todd when she was 30. Todd was affable and easy, the kind of man who never caused trouble and never created anything either. He coached Little League on weekends and he liked his sports teams and he was perfectly pleasant to be around, in the way that beige is perfectly pleasant to look at. He and Melissa had 3 children in 5 years, our grandchildren, Emma and Jake and baby Rosie, and Melissa had stopped working outside the home when Emma was born and seemed to have made her life into something that revolved entirely around her children and her social circle, and her opinions about people who were not present to defend themselves. I noticed things shifting in the years after the grandchildren arrived. Small things at first. The way Courtney would redirect conversations away from me at family dinners. The way Melissa had started talking about Richard's business, about what it was worth, about what would happen to it eventually, in ways that felt less like curiosity and more like calculation. The way Daniel had started deferring to Courtney in family discussions in a manner that made him seem less like my son and more like her spokesperson. But Richard was healthy and the business was thriving, and my grandchildren were growing up wild and beautiful, and I told myself that every family has friction, and that these were small things, manageable things. The normal friction of adult children building their own lives. I told myself this for years. I was very good at telling myself things. Richard's first health scare came when he was 61. A cardiac event. The doctors preferred that term to heart attack. Though the distinction felt academic to me when I was sitting in a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m. holding my own hands. He recovered well, and he changed his diet, and he started walking 4 miles every morning. And for a while things felt stable again, felt like we had been given a warning, and heeded it properly. But the body keeps its own schedule regardless of your plans. 3 years after the first event, there was a second one. More serious this time, more lasting in its effects. Richard came home from the hospital with a list of restrictions and a new relationship with his own mortality. And I watched him reckon with that relationship over the months that followed. Watched him become quieter and more deliberate. Watched him spend longer hours in his home office with the door half closed. Watched him make phone calls that he didn't mention afterward. I noticed during this period that Daniel and Melissa had started spending more time at the house, coming by without much notice, staying for dinner more often. It should have felt like a comfort, and sometimes it did. There were moments when we were all together around the table, and I could almost convince myself that everything was fine, that the closeness was genuine, that my children were simply grown into the people I had hoped they would become. But there were other moments that I tried not to hold on to, moments that came back to me later with the terrible clarity of things you should have paid attention to when they were happening. Like the evening I came into the kitchen for a glass of water and heard Courtney's voice from the living room, low and careful, saying, "If the business is structured properly, the tax implications would be..." And then silence when she heard my footsteps, and the bright, performative smile she gave me when I appeared in the doorway. "Grace, we were just talking about. Nothing important." Like the afternoon I walked past Richard's office and heard him on the phone with someone, and caught the words, "No, she doesn't need to know about this part," before he heard me and changed his tone. I assumed then that it was business. I assumed a lot of things. Like the Saturday morning when I overheard Melissa on her phone in the backyard, pacing in the way she did when she was anxious, saying, "But what if she contests it? Can she contest it? Daniel said Dave told him that legally." And then she saw me watching from the kitchen window, and she smiled and waved as if she hadn't been saying anything at all. I stored these moments in a place inside myself that I tried not to visit too often. I told myself there were explanations. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that I had spent so many years being the one who held things together that I had started seeing cracks everywhere, even in walls that were solid. Richard's health declined more sharply in the final year. There were hospitalizations. There were adjustments to medications. There were days when he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I became his primary caregiver alongside the home health aide we hired. A steady, kind woman named Beverly, who came 3 days a week and treated Richard with a dignity that I will never forget. In those months, my children were present in the way that people are present when they are waiting. They came by. They sat in the living room. They asked questions about Richard's condition with a focused attentiveness that, in retrospect, had more to do with the answers than with concern for their father. I was so exhausted by that point, so deep inside the work of caring for a man I loved while watching him diminish, that I did not have the reserves to scrutinize their attention properly. Courtney started asking about the business paperwork, about the accounts, about where things were filed. She framed it as helpfulness. "I just want to make sure everything is organized so you don't have to worry about it, Grace." And I was grateful. I was honestly grateful, because organizing was the last thing I had the energy for. I gave her access to the filing cabinet in the office. I showed her where the insurance documents were kept. I trusted her because she was my son's wife, and because I was too tired to do anything else. I understand now how catastrophically foolish that was. But I want you to understand that catastrophic foolishness is what happens to people who are drowning. You reach for whatever is near. Richard died on a Thursday morning in October just after sunrise. He had been declining for weeks by then, moving through the rooms of the house with the slowness of someone who is conserving what remains. I was with him. I had slept in the chair beside his bed for 3 nights, because I knew, the way you know these things, the way the body understands what the mind refuses, that we were close to the end. He died with my hand in his, and the early light coming through the curtains and the neighborhood quiet outside, and I sat beside him for a long time after, just sitting, just staying, because leaving the room felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. When I finally came out and called the children, they arrived within the hour, and I noticed, even through the fog of grief, even through the strange flat numbness of that morning, that Courtney had brought a leather portfolio with her, that she went into Richard's office almost immediately, that Daniel followed her and closed the door. I noticed, but I didn't say anything, because I was a widow of 4 hours, and my husband was still in the room down the hall. And there are only so many battles a person can fight at once. The weeks after Richard's death passed in the way that grief weeks pass. Slowly, and then all at once, full of casseroles delivered by neighbors and thank-you notes written on autopilot, and a closet full of his clothes that I wasn't ready to touch. Daniel and Melissa were in and out of the house constantly. There were meetings I wasn't fully included in. Just administrative things, Mom. Don't worry about it. And phone calls that stopped when I entered rooms. And a general atmosphere of efficient busyness that felt, when I examined it at the edges, less like mourning and more like managing. I was still too deep in grief to fight it properly. I kept thinking. Later. I kept thinking. When I have the energy, I kept thinking. Surely they're not doing what it feels like they're doing. And then came the birthday party. It was for Jake, my middle grandchild, Melissa and Todd's son. He was turning 7. Melissa had planned it for weeks. I knew this because I had been the one she called when she needed to talk through the details. The one who had listened to debates about whether to do a superhero theme or a dinosaur theme. The one who had offered to make Jake's favorite chocolate cake from scratch. I arrived at Melissa's house that Saturday afternoon, with the cake I had spent 3 hours making, carefully wrapped and transported in the carrier I had used for every birthday cake I had made, for every one of my grandchildren. The house was already full when I arrived. Other parents and children from Jake's class, a few family friends, Todd's brother, and his wife. There was music and streamers and the particular beautiful chaos of small children at peak excitement. Melissa met me at the door and took the cake from my hands and said, "Oh, thank you, Mom. Perfect timing. Can you take this to the kitchen?" And then she was gone, absorbed back into the party, and I was standing in the front hallway holding my coat and my purse and my empty cake carrier, and I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do next. I went to the kitchen. I set the cake on the counter. I stood for a moment and looked through the doorway into the living room where the party was happening, where my grandchildren were running and laughing, where Daniel and Courtney were standing with drinks in their hands, talking to Todd's brother, like they owned the place, and I thought, they'll come get me in a minute. They'll come introduce me. I'm the grandmother. I'll be included in a moment. I waited. Nobody came. After a while, I noticed that the kitchen counter was covered in the debris of party preparation. Empty chip bags and sauce-stained serving trays and a stack of dirty glasses from whatever the adults had been drinking before I arrived. And because I am who I am, because standing still in a messy kitchen is not something I am capable of, I started cleaning. I washed the glasses. I consolidated the chip bags into the trash. I rinsed the serving trays and stacked them by the sink. And then Courtney appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, "Oh, great. You found the dishes. There's a lot more coming. We figured you could handle the cleanup back here." And she smiled at me, that assessing column of numbers smile, and disappeared back into the party. I stood very still for a moment. My hands were in the dish soap. The sound of the party was a wall of noise just beyond the doorway, and I thought, this is a mistake. She doesn't mean it the way it sounds. I am reading into things. I am still raw from grief, and I am reading into things. So I kept washing. I washed for an hour. The plates came in waves, Courtney and Melissa passing them through the door without quite making eye contact, stacking them on the counter beside me, going back out to the party without a word. Once Melissa came in to refill the juice pitcher, and I said, "Should I come out for a little while? I'd love to see Jake open his presents." And she said, "Oh, we're not doing presents until later. You're great in here." And left. The children sang "Happy Birthday." I could hear it from the kitchen, the whole room full of voices rising and falling. And I stood at the sink with my hands under the running water, and I listened to my grandson turning 7, without me in the room. When the last note faded, Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the pile of dishes, still considerable, and said, "Hey, Mom, can you collect the cake plates when everyone's done? And there's a garbage bag under the sink." And then his phone buzzed and he looked at it and walked away. I stood very still. My son had just handed me a garbage bag at his nephew's birthday party and walked away from me like I was staff, like I was hired help, like I was nobody, like the woman who had raised him, who had loved him for 38 years, who had made the cake currently being eaten in the next room, was simply a feature of the kitchen. I did not cry. I had promised myself I would not cry. But something moved in me in that moment, something deep and tectonic, something that had been building for a long time, under all the polite explanations and the benefit of the doubt and the willful blindness. Something shifted, and I felt it shift, and I understood that I was done pretending I hadn't been seeing what I had been seeing. I collected the cake plates. I tied the garbage bag. I stood at that kitchen sink for 2 more hours while my family celebrated my grandson's birthday in the next room, and I thought about every moment I had stored away and tried not to examine, and I let myself finally, fully look at all of them at once. The party wound down the way children's parties do. Gradually at first, then all at once. Cars pulling out of the driveway, small voices saying goodbye. The particular post-party quiet of a house in which the energy has finally dispersed. I was drying the last of the dishes when Melissa came into the kitchen and said, "Thanks so much, Mom. That was really helpful." And she hugged me briefly and went to find her children, and I stood there in her kitchen, holding a dish towel and understanding with absolute clarity that I was being managed, that I had been managed for a long time, that my grief and my exhaustion and my lifelong tendency to do what needed doing without being asked had made me very, very easy to manage. I gathered my things. I got my coat from the front closet. I said goodbye to my grandchildren, who were the innocent ones in all of this, who climbed on me and demanded hugs with the unreserved love that children give before they learn to calculate. I kissed Jake and told him happy birthday, and that I loved him, and he told me I smelled like soap, and I laughed, and it was a real laugh, a genuine one, because children will do that to you even in the worst moments. I was at the front door, coat on, purse over my shoulder, when the knock came. It was not loud. It was a deliberate, measured knock. 3 counts, pause, 1. Like a signal. Like something agreed upon in advance. I was the closest to the door. I opened it. She was standing on the front step in a grey wool coat, with her silver hair cut close to her head, and her eyes red at the edges, the way eyes get when you have been crying recently, but have composed yourself afterward. My sister-in-law, Richard's younger sister, Eleanor. Eleanor and I had always been close in the way of women who love the same man for different reasons, and understand, without ever quite saying so, that they are on the same team. She lived in Pittsburgh still, had never left, and we saw each other at holidays and called each other more often than siblings-in-law are expected to. And when Richard died, she had driven 4 hours to be at the funeral and had held my hand through most of it without saying anything, because she understood, as some people do, that presence is sometimes more useful than words. "Eleanor," I said, how did you know I was here?" She looked at me with those red-edged eyes and she said, "I knew, because he told me. He called me, Grace, about 3 weeks before he died. He made me promise." Her voice was very steady in the way that voices are when the person using them has rehearsed what they are going to say many times. He said, and I need you to hear this exactly the way he said it. He said, "If they humiliate her, you deliver it." The front door was still open behind me. I could hear Melissa and Todd talking somewhere in the back of the house. I could hear my grandchildren's feet on the stairs. "Deliver what?" I said. Eleanor reached into the large bag she was carrying. Not a purse, a proper bag, a tote bag that looked heavy. And she brought out a manila envelope. It was sealed with packaging tape across the flap, and my name was written on the front in Richard's handwriting. His handwriting that I would know anywhere, that I had been seeing for 34 years, on grocery lists and birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter, that I had thought I would never see again on anything new. My name, in his handwriting, on an envelope I had never seen before. "He had me keep it," Eleanor said. "He didn't want it in the house because he didn't know who might." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "He was very careful about it, Grace. He spent a lot of time being careful." My hands were shaking when I took it. The envelope was thick, not just paper inside, but something else. Something with more density and substance. "Can you take me somewhere quiet?" Eleanor said. "I have more to explain, but not here." I looked back into Melissa's house, at the hallway I had stood in for a moment when I first arrived, hoping to be included, before understanding what my role for the evening was meant to be. I looked at the kitchen I had spent the party in, washing dishes that were not mine, collecting plates like a catering employee, listening to my grandson's birthday through a wall. "Yes," I said. "Let's go." We drove to a diner 3 miles away, and we sat in a corner booth, and Eleanor ordered coffee, and I ordered nothing, and she told me everything. Richard had known, she said. He had known for longer than I had. He had noticed the shifts before I had been watching the patterns more carefully, perhaps because illness gives you a particular kind of clarity about the people around you, strips away the comfortable assumptions, and makes you see what is actually there. He had noticed Courtney's questions about the business structure. He had noticed the conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. He had noticed the way Daniel deferred to his wife's calculations, and the way Melissa had started talking about the house, their house, our house, in the future tense, and he had acted accordingly. The envelope contained, Eleanor explained, a letter from Richard to me, but it also contained contact information for an attorney. Not the family attorney who had handled their estate work for years. A man named Gerald Fitch, whom Courtney had apparently been cultivating as an ally, but a different attorney entirely. A woman named Margaret Okafor, who specialized in estate litigation and had an office in Columbus, and had been retained by Richard 14 months before he died, and had been waiting, with the patience that good attorneys have, for Eleanor's call. There was also a document in the envelope, a copy of a document. The original, Eleanor told me, was in Margaret Okafor's safe. Richard had restructured his will 14 months ago without telling me. Not because he was hiding things from me, but because he was protecting me from the very specific anxiety of knowing that protection was necessary, of spending the final months of our marriage looking at our children and understanding what they were capable of. He had wanted me to have those months free of that knowledge. He had known I would be strong enough to handle it after. He had not wanted me to spend his dying days already fighting. The restructuring was comprehensive and careful, and had been executed with the assistance of Margaret Okafor and a forensic accountant named Robert Singh, who had spent 4 months, quietly and invisibly auditing Harmon Kowalski Electrical and the associated family assets, and documenting everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood that documentation was a form of justice. The business was protected. The house was protected. The accounts were protected. There was a trust, a properly constructed, legally airtight trust, that governed everything, and that specified, in language so precise, it left no room for interpretation, what was mine, and what was not, and what could be challenged, and what absolutely could not. But there was more, because Richard had not only been protecting, he had been watching, and Robert Singh had found things. Courtney had been accessing the business accounts, not dramatically, not emptying them. Nothing so obvious, but carefully, methodically, in the way of someone who understands finance professionally and knows how to move money in amounts small enough to avoid automatic triggers. She had been doing it for 8 months before Richard died. The total by the time Singh finished counting was $114,000. Eleanor put a folder on the table between us as she said this. Inside the folder were pages of transaction records, each one highlighted, each one annotated in Robert Singh's precise accountant's handwriting. I sat with my hands flat on the table, and I looked at the folder, and I felt something that I can only describe as the opposite of surprise, which is not the same as feeling nothing. It is the feeling of something you have been not knowing for a long time finally being given its proper name. Richard wanted to be the one to tell you, Eleanor said. He wanted to handle it himself. But when it became clear that he was running out of time, he put everything in Margaret's hands and mine. He told me, if they treat her the way I'm afraid they're going to treat her when I'm gone, you give her all of this. He didn't want you to have it if they were going to do right by you. She paused. I guess they answered that question for themselves tonight. I thought about the kitchen, about the dishes, about the garbage bag, about my son's face when he handed it to me and walked away, about my grandson turning 7 while I stood at a sink I had never asked to stand at. He knew, I said. It wasn't really a question. He knew, Eleanor said. He loved them. He never stopped loving them. But he knew. I called Margaret Okafor from the parking lot of the diner. It was nearly 9 o'clock on a Saturday evening, and she answered on the 3rd ring, and I understood from the way she answered, steady, prepared, unsurprised, that she had been waiting for this call. Mrs. Harmon, she said, I was hoping you'd reach out. I think it's time we got to work. I was at my grandson's birthday party tonight, I said. I don't know why I told her that. I think I needed someone to know the specific shape of it. There was a pause on her end, brief and full of understanding. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm genuinely sorry." "Don't be," I said. "Tell me what we do next." The weeks that followed were not easy. I want to be honest about that. I sat with Eleanor in Margaret Okafor's office the following Monday morning, a conference room on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Columbus, with a view of the city that Richard would have said was the kind of view that justifies the billing rate. And I listened to the full accounting of what my son and his wife had been doing, and what they had been planning. And there were moments during that meeting when I had to press my hands together very hard under the conference table to keep myself from making a sound that I would have been embarrassed by. Margaret laid everything out with the organized calm of someone who has done this many times and understands that the organized calm is part of the service. She had a presentation, not elaborate, not theatrical, just clear, and she walked me through it section by section. The trust structure first. Richard had established it through Margaret's office 14 months before his death, and it had been structured with the assistance of an estate attorney from Chicago who specialized in exactly this kind of asset protection. The documents were clean. The language was precise. The trust was, in Margaret's words, extremely difficult to challenge on any grounds I'm aware of, and the way she said it communicated both professional confidence and a kind of satisfaction that I found reassuring. Then the business. Robert Singh, who attended the meeting in person, a small, precise man in a navy suit, who shook my hand with both of his and said, "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Harmon," with a sincerity that felt genuine, had completed his audit of Harmon Kowalski's accounts over a period of 4 months. He had done it carefully, with access provided through a court order that Margaret had obtained as a precautionary measure 14 months ago, and he had documented what he found in a report that ran to 63 pages and was indexed and cross-referenced in the way of a man who understood that documentation done well is documentation that can survive being read by a hostile attorney. Courtney had been moving money. Robert walked me through it transaction by transaction. Not all 63 pages, but a representative sample, enough to understand the pattern. She had been using a business account connected to a vendor relationship she had established as part of her helpfulness with the business administration. Small amounts, nothing over $12,000 in any single transaction, distributed across 8 months in a pattern that was clearly designed to avoid the triggering automatic review. The total was $114,260. Robert had the number to the dollar. I looked at the pages, at Courtney's name appearing beside amount after amount, at the dates, which spanned a period beginning approximately 2 months after she first obtained access to the filing cabinet in Richard's office, the access I had given her with gratitude because I was too exhausted to see what I was handing over. "Did Richard know the specific amount?" I asked. "He knew the approximate range," Margaret said. "Robert had completed about 60% of the audit when Richard passed. He knew the pattern and the order of magnitude. He was not surprised by the final number." I thought about Richard sitting with this knowledge, about what it cost him to hold it while he was dying, about the decisions he made. Not to confront, not to accuse, but to document and protect and hand it to someone who could be trusted to act on it at the right time. "He could have told me," I said. Not accusingly, just stating it. "He told me he considered it," Margaret said. "He decided that you had enough to carry. He said." She paused, glanced at her notes. He said he didn't want you to spend his last months looking at your children the way he was looking at them. He thought you deserved better than that. I pressed my hands together under the table. Margaret was everything Richard had apparently believed she was. Precise and uncompromising, and deeply, almost tenderly competent. She spoke about Daniel and Courtney, and Melissa, the way good attorneys speak about opposing parties. Factually, without embellishment, with a kind of professional neutrality that was, in its own way, more devastating than anger would have been. She did not call them greedy or cruel, or any of the words that had occurred to me at various points. She called them the parties, and she described what they had done and planned to do in the language of legal exposure rather than moral judgment, and somehow that restraint made the whole picture more stark rather than less. "Your husband was very thorough," she told me. "In 20 years of estate law, I don't think I've seen documentation this complete." She paused. "He clearly loved you very much." I nodded. I pressed my hands together under the table. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Margaret said, "we send some letters." The letters went out on a Wednesday. One to Daniel and Courtney's home address. One to Melissa and Todd's. Copies to Gerald Fitch, the family attorney Courtney had been cultivating. Margaret had done some research on Fitch and determined that he had had preliminary conversations with Courtney about the estate that constituted, at a minimum, a significant conflict of interest, and the letter to his office was worded with the particular precision of someone communicating that they are aware of something specific and have documented it accordingly. I was not there when they received the letters. I had gone back to my house, properly and legally mine, and I had sat in the kitchen that Richard and I had renovated 12 years ago, with the countertops we had argued pleasantly about for 3 weeks before I found the exact right color at the 4th tile shop we visited, and Richard said, "That's the one, isn't it?" Before I could even say anything, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and I read his letter to me. He had written it 6 months before he died, when he was still strong enough to sit at his desk for hours. The handwriting was steady, not the slightly uncertain handwriting of the last months, but the decisive slanted script of the Richard the firm had known most of my life. The language was Richard, direct and warm and occasionally funny, in the way that some people are funny even in serious moments, a lightness of spirit that I had loved in him for 34 years, and that I found, reading it, was both comforting and devastating in equal measure. He told me he was sorry he hadn't confronted them himself. He told me he had convinced himself for a long time that he was misreading the situation, that the people who had come out of his body and Grace's body could not be capable of what they appeared to be capable of, and that the wanting it to not be true had made him slow to act on what he was seeing. He told me that the illness had made him a realist in ways that health had not, and that he was not sure whether to be grateful for that clarity or to mourn the comfortable blindness it had replaced. He told me that the business was mine to do with, as I chose, to keep, to sell, to pass on, entirely at my discretion, protected from any claim by any party. He told me that the house was mine. He told me that the accounts were mine. He told me that everything he had been built for me, with me, because of me, and that he had made sure, absolutely sure, Margaret and Robert sure, court document sure, that it would remain mine, regardless of what anyone else wanted or tried. And then, near the end of the letter, he wrote, "Grace, you have been taking care of other people your entire life. It has been the most beautiful thing about you, and the thing I have sometimes grieved for you. You have given and given and given, and so often the giving has been taken for granted, by people who should have known better, including, I'm ashamed to say, sometimes me. What I have done here, what Margaret and Robert have put together, is the only way I know how to take care of you, the way you have always taken care of everyone else. I hope it's enough. I think it is. You are the strongest person I have ever known, and I have loved you every day of my life since that church picnic. Take care of yourself, my Grace. You've more than earned it. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after I finished reading that. The evening light was coming through the window over the sink, the same window I had looked out of on 10,000 ordinary evenings. And the house was very quiet, in the way that houses are quiet when you are the only one in them, and you have been used to not being the only one. And I let myself cry. Properly. Finally. Not the tight, controlled not crying of the kitchen at Jake's birthday party, but real crying. The kind that comes up from somewhere deep and takes as long as it takes and doesn't ask your permission. I cried for Richard. I cried for the 34 years we had had together, and the years we were not going to have. I cried for the man who had spent his dying months building me a fortress out of paperwork, because he loved me, and because he knew. And when I was done crying, I washed my face at the kitchen sink. The same running water, different dishes. And I thought, all right. Let's see what happens next. What happened next was that Daniel called me. He called me the evening of the day the letters arrived. I know it was the same evening because I was still at the kitchen table with the tea that had gone cold when my phone rang, and his name appeared on the screen, and I sat for a moment looking at his name and thinking about all the years that name had meant something simple and good. I answered. His voice had a quality I had not heard in it since he was a teenager, who had broken something and was trying to find the angle that would minimize consequences. He said he wanted to talk. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said Courtney was very upset and felt that things had been taken out of context, and that the letter they had received was accusatory and unfair, and that he hoped we could discuss it as a family before things escalated unnecessarily. I listened to him. I let him go through the whole thing. The misunderstanding framing, the out-of-context framing, the let's discuss it as a family framing. He was not a stupid man, and the arguments were not incoherent. They were simply not true. When he finished, I said, Daniel, I know about the $114,000. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I counted 10 full seconds of it. 10 seconds of silence on a phone call is an enormous amount of time. It is long enough for a person to understand that the angle they chose has run out of road. Mom, he said finally, and his voice had changed. The careful management was still there, but underneath it now was something that sounded, if I was being charitable, like genuine distress. There's an explanation for that. I'm sure there is, I said. You can explain it to Margaret Okafor. I'll give you her number. I don't think... He stopped. Mom, can we just talk? In person? Without the attorneys involved? Daniel, I said, and I tried to say it with the gentleness that it deserved, because whatever he had allowed to happen, he was still my son, and that would never not be true. I love you. I have loved you since 6 in the morning on a Tuesday in February, when you were the most furious-looking person I had ever seen. That is not going to change. But we are past the point of talking without the attorneys. We got here because of choices that were made. That's not my doing. He tried twice more. Variations on the same argument, circling back through different framings. And I held firm each time with the kind of steadiness that I did not know I had until I needed it. When we hung up, I sat for a while with the phone in my hands, and I thought about the boy he had been. The watchful, serious baby. The careful questioner. The son who had called me from college when something was wrong and talked for an hour without asking for anything. Just needing to hear my voice. He was still that person somewhere inside whatever he had become. I held on to that. Melissa called the next morning. Melissa's approach was different. She went for emotion rather than logic, which was consistent with who she had always been. She cried, and the crying sounded real enough that I felt the pull of it, the old reflexive instinct to comfort, to reassure, to make the distress stop. I recognized the instinct, and I held it still. She told me I was being manipulated by Eleanor, who had always been jealous of their family, who had never liked her or Daniel, who had her own agenda. She told me that Richard's illness had made him paranoid, and that the documents were the product of a paranoid old man being influenced by a predatory attorney who charged by the hour and had an incentive to create conflict. She said that she and Daniel had only ever tried to help, with the business paperwork, with the accounts, and that being accused of theft was the most hurtful thing that had ever happened to her. I let her finish. I thought about Eleanor sitting on the front step of Melissa's house in her gray wool coat, having driven 4 hours because Richard had asked her to. I thought about what jealous, agenda-driven people do when someone they love is dying. They drive 4 hours and stand on doorsteps with envelopes they have been keeping safe for months because a man trusted them. And then I said, "Melissa, I was at Jake's birthday party last Saturday. I spent the entire party washing dishes in your kitchen. I didn't see a single room in your house that wasn't the kitchen. When the children sang happy birthday to your son, I was collecting plates." I paused. The line was very quiet. Your father knew who you had become. I just took longer to see it. She had nothing to say to that. After a moment, she hung up. The legal process took 4 months. Courtney had retained an attorney. A good one, competent and aggressive in the way of attorneys who specialize in estate disputes. Someone who knew how to find the places where documents had ambiguities and work them. But Margaret had built the case with such comprehensive documentation that each challenge ran into a wall of evidence and came back deflated. The trust language was reviewed by 2 independent estate attorneys at Courtney's attorney's request. Both concluded that it was valid and enforceable. The business audit was challenged on methodological grounds. Robert Singh responded to each challenge in writing with supporting documentation, and after the 3rd such exchange, the challenges stopped. The money Courtney had taken was repaid in full, every cent of the $114,260, as part of a settlement agreement that also included a formal, signed acknowledgement of the misappropriation. Margaret had insisted on the acknowledgement. When I asked her why, when the money being returned seemed like the essential thing, she said, "Because your husband spent 4 months documenting the truth. The least we can do is make sure the truth is on record." I thought about that for a while after she said it. I thought about what it means to insist on the truth being recorded when the easy thing would be to take the money and call it done. Richard had understood something about legacy that I was still learning. That what you leave behind is not just what you have accumulated, but what you have insisted on. Gerald Fitch quietly withdrew from any association with the matter about 6 weeks into the process. I imagine he had assessed the situation and made a sensible professional decision. I bore him no particular ill will. He was a man who had been flattered and cultivated, and had not looked carefully enough at what he was being flattered into. There are many such people. Most of them are not malicious. They are merely insufficiently cautious. The business, Harmon Kowalski Electrical, which Dave Kowalski had been running on his own since Richard's death, and doing a perfectly good job of, because Dave had always been the steadier hand of the partnership, though he was the less visible one. I sold to Dave at fair market value, which Margaret and Robert Singh had independently assessed, and which Dave, to his great credit, did not try to negotiate below. He had been Richard's friend and partner for 30 years, and he handled the transaction with the straightforward honesty of a man who had always operated that way and saw no reason to change. I gave him the good grill from the backyard, as part of the deal. He laughed when I told him. I meant it seriously. It was the right home for it. I stayed in the house. Our house. My house. I repainted the living room a color I had wanted for years, and Richard had always vetoed with good humor. I started having Eleanor visit more often. She comes for long weekends now, and we talk about Richard in the way that you can only talk about someone you have both loved, with honesty and humor and grief that has found its proper shape. I see my grandchildren. I have been careful and deliberate about this. Careful not to use them. Careful not to let my feelings about their parents contaminate the air they breathe. Emma and Jake and Rosie are innocent of everything, and I will not let them feel the weight of what the adults in their lives have done. When I see them, I am their grandmother. Full stop. That is the most important thing. Daniel and I have a relationship now that I would describe as careful. We have had 2 real conversations, long ones, uncomfortable ones, in which he has said things that sounded like apology, and I have said things that were honest, and we are somewhere in the middle of figuring out whether there is a foundation left to build on. I don't know yet. I am trying to be fair about it. I am trying to remember that he was not acting alone, and that Courtney's influence over him had been building for a long time before I noticed it. Melissa and I are further apart. She has not yet arrived at the place where accountability is possible. She still finds ways to cast herself as the wronged party, to frame what happened as something that was done to her, rather than by her. I have stopped trying to argue her into a different understanding. Some people have to travel that road on their own schedule, or not at all. But here is what I know. I know that my husband loved me with the kind of love that does not stop at the grave. I know that he watched the people he had raised reveal themselves, and he quietly, methodically, with all the care he had always brought to things that mattered, made sure that when the moment came, I would not be left without what was mine. I know that the strongest thing I have ever done was not fighting. It was not the phone calls or the legal meetings or the confrontations. The strongest thing I did was stand at a kitchen sink on a Saturday afternoon and wash dishes that were not mine to wash and not say a single word, because the time for words had already been arranged by someone who loved me for exactly the right moment. I know that I am 61 years old, and I live in a house that is mine, and I am surrounded by people who are worth being surrounded by. I know that grief does not go away, but that it changes shape over time, that it compresses from something that fills the whole room into something you can carry in your chest, heavy but manageable, yours. I know that my husband was right about one thing above all else. I am strong enough to survive anything. I just had to stop using all my strength to take care of people who were not taking care of me. If you are watching this, and you are the person who always ends up in the kitchen, the one who does the dishes while the party happens in the next room, the one who shows up and stays late and gives and tells themselves that being needed is the same as being valued, I want you to hear this directly. It is not the same. It has never been the same. And the people who truly love you know the difference. Richard knew. He always knew. And he made sure I would be okay. If this story stayed with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel More stories are coming, real ones, about real people who found their way through. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time someone surprised you with an act of love you weren't expecting. I read every single one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And remember, the people who make you feel invisible have no idea what you're actually holding. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.